They used to say size doesn't matter. But in the 21st century global economy, size, especially market size, is everything. And India has quietly grown into a juggernaut. With over 1.4 billion people and a fast expanding middle class, India's domestic market is no longer just a passive consumer base. It is now a weapon, a strategic asset, a diplomatic bargaining chip, and increasingly, India is learning how to use it. For decades, India was seen as a reluctant player in global trade wars. It lacked the manufacturing muscle of China or the economic dominance of the United States. But things have changed. What India may lack in export volume is compensating for with import leverage, the quiet power to grant or deny access to the world's fastest growing consumer market. Take the recent tensions between India and the European Union. Behind closed doors, officials from Brussels are increasingly frustrated. They want access to India's massive pharmaceuticals market, its digital services, its agricultural exports. But India, confident in its position, has begun to set conditions: data localization, tariff protections, subsidies for domestic champions. Western companies find themselves jumping through hoops because India knows it can afford to make them. The same playbook is being used with big tech. After years of allowing foreign digital giants free rein, New Delhi is now asserting control. Google, Amazon, Facebook, all are being pushed to store data locally, comply with content rules, and invest in local infrastructure. For years, these firms saw India as a growth market. Now they realize it's also a battlefield. This isn't just economic nationalism, it's strategic realism. In a world fractured by tariffs and sanctions, India's ability to weaponize its market is becoming central to its foreign policy. The goal is not just protection, it's positioning. India doesn't just want trade, it wants leverage, it wants terms, and the world is beginning to understand. During the recent US-India trade talks, for instance, Washington walked in expecting concessions on digital taxes and import duties. What it got instead was a firm reminder: if US companies want to sell to India, they must play by India's rules, and those rules are shifting to favor Indian data, Indian innovation, Indian infrastructure. This isn't protectionism in the old sense, it's strategic reciprocity. India knows its market is too big to ignore, so it's no longer begging for trade deals. It's setting the terms. It's telling the world, access comes at a price, and here's the genius of it. This shift is happening without the loud drama we see in China or Russia. No bans, no boycotts, just slow surgical moves, regulatory frameworks, licensing barriers, preferential procurement. Foreign companies aren't being pushed out, they're being reprogrammed, and slowly they're aligning to Indian interests. Let's take an example: Apple. For years, iPhones were assembled in China and shipped to India with high import duties. But now, as Apple wants to expand its Indian market share, it's setting up manufacturing in India itself. The market isn't just a revenue source, it's now a production magnet. And India gains jobs, tech transfer, and political capital. India is learning from the best, including China, but it's executing with more subtlety. While China often uses brute force to control markets, India is using its size, promise, and positioning. The message is simple: if you want access to India's rising consumer class, you need to contribute to India's rise. And this strategy is catching on across sectors. In defense, global arms manufacturers are now being asked to co-produce with Indian firms. In pharmaceuticals, multinationals must align with Indian IP rules. In telecom, domestic players are being given preference in public contracts. This is not a retreat from globalization, it's a recalibration. India is not closing its doors, it's just installing a toll booth. In the coming parts, we'll see how this weaponization of market access is reshaping India's relationship with the US, the EU, China, and even the global South, and why it could define the future of global trade. India's strength isn't just in its population size, it's in its growing digital ecosystem, its unified tax and payment infrastructure, and its increasingly centralized market power. These are now being quietly weaponized, not against countries directly, but to influence corporations, policymakers, and supply chains around the world. Take the example of e-commerce. Global giants like Amazon and Walmart once entered India expecting a passive consumer base, but India flipped the game. Through regulatory tweaks, digital commerce frameworks like ONDC, Open Network for Digital Commerce, and data localization mandates, India forced these firms to play by its rules or risk being locked out. ONDC in particular represents a revolutionary attempt to democratize e-commerce, reducing the dominance of major platforms and empowering small sellers. It's not just market reform, it's digital statecraft. In pharmaceuticals, India is leveraging its generic drug industry and low-cost manufacturing to become a pharmacy to the world. But beyond supplying cheap generics, India is starting to withhold certain formulations during global shortages, sending subtle messages about its strategic value in global health diplomacy. Then there's tech and semiconductors. As the West looks to decouple from China, India is rapidly positioning itself as the next major assembly and design hub. With government schemes like Make in India and massive semiconductor subsidy packages, New Delhi is offering a powerful carrot to global chip makers. But it's also making clear that market access comes with conditions: respect for Indian data laws, investment in local infrastructure, and support for India's geopolitical priorities. India is no longer begging for trade deals, it's dictating terms, and this shift is not lost on its adversaries. China, for instance, is witnessing how India's model is reshaping the global south. African nations and ASEAN economies are watching India stand up to digital giants and foreign investors without losing growth momentum, and they are taking notes. Even the European Union, long seen as a regulatory powerhouse, is encountering resistance in trade negotiations with India. Brussels wants digital data access and IP protections. India wants manufacturing jobs and technology transfer. The balance of power has changed. India knows the future belongs to those who control demand, not just supply. This quiet confidence is unsettling for some in Washington and Brussels, but for others, it represents a long overdue rebalancing in the global order. India, once the poster child of globalization's vulnerabilities, is now becoming its strategic gatekeeper. Foreign investors, especially in sectors like electronics, semiconductors, and electric vehicles, are learning fast. Access to India's market comes at a price, and that price is often Make in India. Companies that once treated India as just another consumer base are now finding themselves recalibrating entire strategies just to gain entry. Apple is a perfect example. Once heavily reliant on Chinese manufacturing, Apple has shifted part of its production to India, not merely for diversification, but because staying in the Indian market increasingly requires having a presence within India. Local sourcing norms, incentives for domestic assembly, and quiet diplomatic nudges have made it clear India is no longer just a marketplace. It is a geopolitical lever. This isn't protectionism in the old sense. This is strategic openness. India doesn't close its doors, but it sets the terms of entry. It doesn't build walls, it builds filters. If a company wants to profit from India's billion-plus consumers, it must invest in India's economy, create Indian jobs, and transfer Indian know-how. The message is clear: welcome to India, but don't treat us like a colony. Take Tesla. Elon Musk's electric dream has been welcomed, but not without Indian terms. India wants not just sales but manufacturing, not just branding but batteries, not just profit but partnership. Tesla, if it wants to dominate here, must help India dominate somewhere too, perhaps in EV supply chains or green tech innovation. What's fascinating is how India is turning even global crises into strategic inflection points. The semiconductor war between the US and China opened up rare opportunities. India didn't wait. It launched a $10 billion incentive scheme to attract chip makers. Micron signed up. Others followed. And again, the deal was the same: access to India's growing market in exchange for making India part of your global value chain. India is now playing a longer game. It knows the age of cheap China-made goods is wobbling. It knows the West is looking for a reliable, rule-of-law-based democratic partner to offset Beijing. So India is slowly recasting itself, not just as the next China in terms of market size, but as the anti-China in terms of values. India is leveraging its market, not just to attract investment, but to reshape the very geography of global capitalism. Its goal is not just development, but alignment, to make sure those who profit from India are also partners in India's rise, politically, economically, and strategically. This shift is quiet, but revolutionary. Markets have always been about profit. India is making them about power,
But India didn't arrive at this moment by accident. It was the result of decades of policy mistakes corrected, economic bottlenecks dismantled, and one core realization that size, when wielded with discipline, becomes a superpower. When global tech giants were busy appeasing Chinese regulators for access to that vast market, India was quietly building its own wall, not to keep foreign firms out, but to force them to play by Indian rules if they wanted in. The strategy was neither isolationist nor reckless. It was surgical. It was slow, but it was deliberate. India began shaping laws that forced global companies to store data locally. Then came tighter e-commerce rules, digital taxations, and regulations around payments and content moderation. Many saw this as protectionism, but hindsight tells a different story. India was laying the groundwork for digital sovereignty. It wasn't about rejecting globalization. It was about bargaining from a place of strength. Now, in this new era of trade wars and fractured alliances, that strength is being tested and weaponized. Multinational corporations, faced with choosing between political alignment and market access, are increasingly finding that India is not only large, but loud. It speaks the language of fairness, reciprocity, and compliance, but it is unafraid to threaten expulsion when red lines are crossed. This became clear in the telecom sector when India banned dozens of Chinese apps overnight. But unlike other nations that followed suit, India didn't flinch under WTO pressure or corporate lobbying. It stood its ground and then offered incentives to homegrown alternatives to fill the void. This was not just digital hygiene. It was strategic signaling. The lesson was simple. Access to India's billion-user market is no longer automatic. It is conditional on behavior, on alignment, on respect for sovereignty. And this conditionality is now the beating heart of India's trade posture. But there's another layer to this weaponization: soft power through market access. For allies, India opens the doors wider. For antagonists, it raises tariffs, withholds approvals, or delays regulatory green lights. It's not overt hostility, it's calibrated leverage. And companies, even the most powerful ones, have started to internalize this. If a global CEO has not been to New Delhi in the past 12 months, they're probably out of touch with the future of trade. This shift isn't just happening in tech. From pharmaceuticals to semiconductors, India is building trusted supply chains with partners it sees as stable, democratic, and aligned. It is inviting companies fleeing China to set up shop, not just with tax breaks, but with market guarantees. And in return, India demands three things: respect for its laws, willingness to invest in its future, and understanding that this is a two-way street. If you want Indian consumers, you must support Indian capacity. If you want access, you must offer equity. This is the new calculus, a blend of realism and nationalism, grounded in pragmatism. It may ruffle feathers in Brussels or Washington, but it resonates in Nairobi, in Jakarta, in Brasilia, where nations tired of dependency are watching how India uses its size as a shield and a sword. India's strategy is not to mimic China's coercion, but to offer a democratic model of assertive trade. It's about saying yes, but on India's terms. It's about transforming market power into diplomatic power, economic independence into geopolitical influence, and most of all, it's about never again being on the back foot when the next global supply shock hits. Because India has learned, sometimes painfully, that in a fragmented world, those who don't weaponize their strengths become victims of others' strengths. This is no longer the India that begged for access or signed FTAs out of desperation. This is a country that is setting the terms and demanding that others pay attention, not out of arrogance, but out of clarity. Clarity that 1 billion users are not just a number, they are a negotiation tool, a defense mechanism, and increasingly, a bargaining chip in a world that no longer plays by old rules. India is no longer waiting to be invited to the table. It's building its own and deciding who gets to sit at it.